All right, welcome to Biology 1010, the online lectures. Here is our first lecture, Chapter 1, Scientific Study of Life. Okay, science. We have to define science. Science refers to a system of acquiring knowledge, and the system uses observation and experimentation to describe and explain natural phenomena. The term science also refers to the organized body of knowledge people have gained using that system. Less formally, the word science often describes any systematic field of study or the knowledge gained from that study. A hypothesis and a theory. These are two very important terms in science and two terms that are frequently misunderstood in non-scientific circles. A hypothesis is the best possible explanation. In science, in order to be called a scientific hypothesis, the hypothesis must be testable. There are hypotheses that are not testable, which makes them non-scientific hypotheses. Science cannot test a non-scientific hypothesis. A theory. This is very misused and misunderstood. In the U.S., especially in the common usage, it's used interchangeably with hypothesis. In fact, a scientific theory is a hypothesis that has enough experimental data that it is generally accepted as fact by the majority of scientists. However, I have heard people refer to things in science and go, oh, it's just a theory. Well, remember, gravity is a theory. Do you doubt that if you jump off a building, you're going to fall? Okay. Now, not everything is known about gravity, but it is technically a theory. Definition of theory most people are familiar with is a supposition or system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained. In common usage, because people don't know the difference, they would put synonyms as hypothesis, thesis, conjecture, supposition, speculation, etc. But that is not what a scientific theory is. Unfortunately, when we refer to scientific theories, we don't say the scientific theory of gravity, we say the theory of gravity. Because in science, theory means more. Thus, such a scientific theory is well substantiated. It's an explanation of some aspect of the natural world based on a body of facts that have been repeatedly confirmed through observation and experimentation. Such fact-supported theories are not guesses, but reliable accounts of the real world that have gone through extensive testing. Why are there different definitions? Well, a hypothesis is just an assumption, an idea that it's proposed for the sake of argument. It can be tested to see if it might be true. In the scientific method, the hypothesis is constructed before any applicable research has been done. Apart from a basic background review, you ask a question, read up on what has been studied before, and then you form a hypothesis. The hypothesis is usually tentative. It's an assumption or suggestion made strictly for the objective of being tested. Now, in science, we do something else that a lot of people who are non-scientists don't understand. A scientist forms a hypothesis, and we don't try to prove it. We try to disprove it. So if we have a hypothesis, we try to test it to see if we can find a flaw in the hypothesis. If we don't find a flaw in the hypothesis, then we accept that the hypothesis was correct. All right? And that's a very important distinction. You don't want people trying to prove that a hypothesis is fact. A theory, in contrast, is a principle that's been formed as an attempt to explain things that have already been substantiated by data. It's used in the names of a number of principles accepted in the scientific community, such as the Big Bang Theory. Because of the rigors of experimentation and control, it's understood to be more likely to be accurate or true than a hypothesis is. In non-scientific use, however, hypothesis and theory are often used interchangeably. This leads to a lot of miscommunications, and people don't understand these miscommunications, and that's where confusion occurs. Why are different definitions for the same word? Well, since this casual use does away with distinctions, upheld by the scientific community, hypothesis and theory are prone to being wrongly interpreted, even when they're encountered in scientific contexts, or at least contexts that allude to scientific study, without making the critical distinction that scientists employ when weighing hypotheses and theories. The most common occurrence is when a theory is interpreted and sometimes even gleefully seized upon to mean something having less truth or fact value than other scientific principles. The word law applies to principles so firmly established that they're almost never questioned, such as the law of gravity. Although the law of gravity recently has come under fire, and many scientists have reduced it back to a theory, given that there are places on the planet where gravity doesn't work the same as everywhere else, especially one place up in Canada. All right? And there are some other aspects of gravity. The idea of a graviton, a particle that causes the force between two items. Nobody has yet seen a graviton, and yet that is a part of that theory. The mistake's one of projection, since we use theory in general to mean something lightly speculated, but it's implied that scientists must be talking about the same level of uncertainty when they use theory to refer to their well-tested and reasoned principles. Science certainly hasn't done a really good job of making the distinction known, and this is also a problem in that most people don't read scientific publications. They'll read a little bit about science in a newspaper or on some little website, and you can tell that the reporter or the person writing the article doesn't really get the article. They're just trying to go through and summarize it and reduce its complexity for the average person to understand, and often a lot is lost in that translation. In the vein of why there are these different definitions, Kenneth Miller, a cell biologist at Brown University, said, "A theory doesn't mean a hunch or a guess. A theory is a system of explanations that ties together a whole bunch of facts. It not only explains those facts, but predicts what you ought to find from other observations and experiments. A good theory is able to predict what will occur in the observable universe, and that observable universe will reflect the theory. Theories are never completely infallible. They form the basis of scientific reasoning because, as Miller said, to the best of our ability, we've tested them and they've held up." That's another fact that people have problems with when it comes to looking at scientific theories. Most people want a black and white scenario. It's either a fact or it's not. Well, in science, the way that we do science, we're never going to prove anything 100%, because as we gather more data and get more data to support eventually a theory, all right, at that point, new things will arise that we hadn't thought of. And so theories do evolve and change over time. We find out new facts. For instance, dinosaurs were feathered. Now, this was really a controversial thing when it was first proposed, but the fossil evidence that we have found and continued to find has now further reinforced the idea that some species of dinosaur did have feathers. And then to really put the nail in the coffin, we found dinosaur feathers in amber. Okay? And so we have altered dinosaur theory. And so theories are constantly evolving, but just because we haven't proved something 100%, if we've proved it 95%, it's a pretty good guess that that's probably accurate. And, we have to get up into the 90s before we call it a theory. All right. So then we have to ask the question, why do people challenge scientific data? Why do they choose to believe things like the earth is flat, vaccinations cause autism, my flu vaccine gave me the flu, man never landed on the moon, it was all a conspiracy, climate change isn't real, there's a hollow earth conspiracy, InfoWars, chemtrails, on and on and on. Why do people do that? Well, this stuff that these people choose to believe in is called pseudoscience. It has two characteristics. It's based on an untestable hypothesis, or it's supported and relies upon logical fallacies. In most cases, pseudoscience is based upon a belief rather than observable fact. And a lot of people want to believe things. A belief is accepting as true something that cannot be tested and has absolutely no data to support it. A belief, by its very nature, cannot have data to support it. Beliefs are based upon untestable hypotheses. Now, at this point, somebody always says something along the lines of, but people believe we landed on the moon. Well, that's a matter of semantics. You don't believe in scientific topics. You either accept them or you reject them. Belief doesn't enter the equation. So am I insulting your beliefs? No way. Science can't be used to determine the validity of a belief system based upon an untestable hypothesis. It's also important to understand that just because a hypothesis is untestable or non-scientific, that does not mean it is incorrect, wrong, or bad. It just means it's not science. Something being not science is okay. Not everything in the world is science. So, back to why belief and accept mean different things. Some people believe that our vocabulary is less than it used to be. However, even though you can find many places that state it has the majority of those statements, is based upon a couple of studies that have been misconstrued. But just for fun, let's check on your vocab. You can do this. You'll have this PowerPoint lecture in your eLearn shell, and so you can do this if you want. It's a vocabulary test given to adults to determine vocabulary knowledge. You get a piece of scrap paper and you record your answers, and this isn't a grade. It's just designed to see what your vocab skills are if you're interested. And so you will answer these questions, and don't cheat. Just try to answer them at some point, and then you can see how you do. All right. The national average is 6.5. If you didn't get that many, you might consider reading more books. By the way, Facebook, Twitter, or social media accounts don't really count towards reading. Okay. In most cases, people don't read the whole article. The article is usually very short and abbreviated. It'll be a link. And a lot of people, it's been shown, studies have shown that on these social media accounts, all they read is maybe the headline and one or two sentences, and then they're on to the next thing. Okay? So not the same as reading a book. Testable versus untestable. It's important to acknowledge the difference. Okay? Now, just because it's not testable doesn't mean that it's wrong or it has no value or it's bad or whatever. It just means it's not science. Value judgments. We don't make value judgments in science. We don't settle on is it good or is it bad. Okay? All science does is determine factual information. For example, when science determined that the Earth was not the center of the universe around which everything orbited, that was not good or bad, it was just a fact. People and their beliefs put a good or bad label on it, or on other scientific facts. The result is that just because someone says that something is not science, that does not mean they are saying it is bad or wrong. So, you don't have to get your hackles up if science ever challenges one of your beliefs. It's just saying we can't test it, we can't comment on it, so it really is not within the realm of science. Dunning-Kruger effect. This is a fascinating study that I find really interesting because it has shown that the less a person knows about the topic, the more likely they are to stubbornly take a position that's factually incorrect. The highest confidence in a topic is by the people that know the least about it. And here is confidence versus competence. All right? So if you have very little knowledge of something, you tend to have a higher confidence that you're right. And you'll stubbornly stick to it, even when facts are presented to show that your position is not accurate. Now, as you develop your knowledge and hopefully become educated, this is what this means, okay? As you become educated, one of the important facts about education is you're going to learn just how much you don't know. So a pretty well-educated person is pretty flexible if facts are presented, even if those facts coincide or conflict with something they want to believe. And then from average, as you complete your education and you start getting up into graduate schools, things like that, experts have very good knowledge. Like, for instance, I know, because I've done a lot of time studying and reading and digging up dinosaur bones, that there are species that were feathered. All right. Bias. Facts are arrived at differently. Scientific facts are discovered using the scientific method by a person that really doesn't have an allegiance or desire to get a specific outcome. They're neutral. If the facts support the hypothesis or not doesn't matter. In other words, a scientist doesn't have anything at stake. The only thing that a scientist wants to do is answer the question as accurately as possible, to test a hypothesis and see if that data supports the hypothesis. If it doesn't, that's okay too. And that's why we try to disprove it. By trying to disprove your hypothesis, you're removing bias. People that try to prove their hypothesis tend to be more biased. So a good way to determine, have you ever met someone that comes to a conclusion and then they go back and they start picking, we call it cherry picking. They'll look over and they'll find a few things that support their desired conclusion, and then they'll ignore everything else that doesn't agree with their desired conclusion. I read an article by an alleged geologist who basically believed that the earth was not billions of years old. So what he did, and this is how he did it, he went into scientific journals and he found 8 instances where a scientist had discovered that a mistake was made. There was a problem in dating a rock, basically. Now, the scientist figured out why the problem occurred, and once they took that into account, it was able to fix the dating process, and the chemical dating worked. This person didn't look at that. All he did was said, okay, here's an example. He found 8 or 10 examples of scientists saying, okay, we tested a rock and we found a flaw in the dating system. And that's where he stopped. He didn't look past that and go, okay, well, and when they fixed the flaw, it dated right again. And what it came down to, it was they basically had tested some fresh lava, and it came up that it was much older than it was because it was brand new rock. So when lava cools and becomes rock, if you date it, it's going to show that it's very, very young rock. Well, this lava hardened, and they tested it, and they said it was something like 50,000 years old. Well, what they found is in some volcanoes, little pockets of nitrogen will form in the lava. And when you do a test on that, a radiometric testing on that area, it will screw up the dates. So now they know, they found a way to manipulate samples so that, and it will detect if there are these pockets of nitrogen in the sample, and that's going to skew the results. But he didn't look at that. All he did was just say, oh, these were false. Now, he found 8 that he could cite as being flawed. He completely ignored the millions of others that you could cite that show that radiometric and geologic dating processes work. Basically, they're chemistry. Chemistry always works the same. If chemistry didn't always work the same, every time you took a drug, you would never know. Is it going to help you, hurt you, kill you, cure you? But because chemistry is a series of constants, we know what happens when 2 different elements combine or are split apart. Okay, and so that was a very biased article. Incorrect information. The problem is compounded by the decline of print and accountability. Previously, if you wanted to publish a book on, say, dinosaurs, you do your research, write the book, then give it to the publisher. The publisher would read and fact check your book. There are fact checkers out there. And these other people will read it, they'll edit it. I misspelled edit, sorry. I'm going to fix that right now. All right. Fact check your book and edit it. And then another group of people in the field of the book would read it as well. And so if you get, say, a book from University of Tennessee at Knoxville, you know that it has been thoroughly looked at in this manner. But then you can go to a website, and who fact checks any of that? Because anybody can get a website. Anybody can write anything they want on their website. And so people will try to cite these as facts, when in fact they don't rely on any kind of testable hypothesis or scientific method. And so, but it's in print, it's on the internet, it must be real. It must be a fact. Well, that's not true, because you can write anything you want on the internet. This works, again, in print, in books, from reliable publishing houses. There are now some very unreliable publishing houses. You can write a book, convert it into a PDF, and go to Amazon and publish your own book. Well, it's a book. Yeah, but who published it? Well, I did. Okay, well, I can't see any reason why somebody would want to lie in a book that they published. So you have to look at your sources and be cautious. Here's some examples of some things that have come out. The QAnon conspiracies. This one is my favorite, the Pizzagate. Basically, a website published something that said that the personal email account of this guy, John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, was hacked in a spear phishing attack. WikiLeaks published his emails in November 2016. Now, people who believed and conspired this Pizzagate conspiracy theory claimed that the emails contained coded messages that connected several high-ranking Democratic Party officials in U.S. restaurants with an alleged human trafficking and child sex ring. One of the restaurants named was the Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria in D.C. The conspiracy theory was spread on social media outlets such as 4chan, 8chan, and Twitter in response, a man from North Carolina traveled up there and to investigate it. He walked in with an AR-15, fired it inside the restaurant, wanted to go down to the basement to see this. Okay? Unfortunately, that restaurant doesn't even have a basement. And the people that started threatening the owner and workers. This conspiracy theory got a resurgence in 2020 and is being spread by QAnon conspiracy theorists as well as young people. It became less expressly political in nature, with emphasis away from Clinton personally and onto an alleged worldwide elite of child sex traffickers. This probably has something to do with the Jeffrey Epstein case. Why do you think people choose to reject scientific concepts? Probably a couple of reasons, but there's some actual research done on this topic. You can go to this link and watch it, and it will give you a slideshow presentation that you might find interesting that might explain it. What's science based upon? Naturalistic scientific paradigm. The naturalistic scientific paradigm means that if you can see it occur, you can explain it in detail, anything that occurs in the real universe can be discovered. There's nothing that exists that we cannot eventually find an answer to. Here is the scientific method. It always starts with somebody making an observation. We see something, okay? And we basically decide, okay, why does this occur? How does this occur? Etc. First step you always do, you look to see if anybody's done any work on the topic you're looking at. All right, there's no need to do research if the research has already been done. You look at everything you can that relates to it, you formulate your hypothesis, and you make your predictions. In this case, we're looking at a vaccine for a rotavirus. It's common, causes a lot of illnesses. How do we make a vaccine? Well, first thing we're going to do, the question is, can we make a vaccine that's effective? We go to the journals of medical science, etc. We find out everything we can about rotavirus, okay, and we formulate a hypothesis. The vaccine will stimulate the immune system to produce antibodies to the rotavirus illness, which will neutralize it and keep it from causing disease. So that's our prediction. We're saying, hey, if we have an effective vaccine, then vaccinated children should have lower incidence of rotavirus illness. We collect and interpret the data because we're testing it. We're giving kids this vaccine. And then we consult prior knowledge, and we can draw conclusions. If before the vaccine, 10,000 out of 100,000 were getting the rotavirus, and then we tested it, and only 100 out of 10,000 got the rotavirus, we know that it is now a pretty effective vaccine. Sometimes we have to make adjustments because viruses mutate, okay? And in some cases, vaccines won't keep you from getting the disease, but it will reduce the severity of the disease. Okay? If you have a virus that normally kills humans and you take the vaccine, and because you've jump-started your immune system, you only get a little sick, well, that's not as big of a deal. Once you've drawn your conclusions, you'll publish and undergo peer review. And that's where other scientists will look and they will do their darndest to figure out a way that you made a mistake. So you definitely don't want that to happen. Occasionally it does. There's kind of a list of the scientific method. Facts about conducting scientific research. Remember, we always try to prove our hypotheses false. If you set out to prove your hypothesis, and you're probably biased, okay, and you don't want to be biased. Science never proves anything 100%. Nothing, not even a scientific law, is ever proven 100%. But we get enough data that confidence is extremely high that it is accurate. Okay? There's no magical giant answer book, all right, that scientists can check to determine if they're correct. What they can do is test as many parts of a hypothesis as they can. Every time they try to prove the hypothesis wrong and they can't, they eliminate a possibility. This produces data and evidence which will continue to increase supporting the hypothesis. Now, imagine a box, okay? And somebody puts something in the box. And they say, okay, experiment on the box and try to tell me what is in the box. It could be any number of things. And so you go through and you test it and you come up, well, I'm pretty sure it's this. Okay? Well, now you can open the box and see if you were right. Scientists can't do that. All right? The only data we get is from the evidence that we generate through our scientific method. There is no giant answer book to see if we were right. Ultimately, we'll gain enough evidence and data to support the elevation of a hypothesis to a scientific theory, and maybe even up to a scientific law. It can take a long time to do that. Or we can find evidence that does not support our hypothesis, in which case that hypothesis will be discarded and a new hypothesis will be found. So let's say at first you thought you had a nail in your box, but when you weigh it, and you weigh what the nail, you say, okay, I think it's this nail is in the box. You weigh the box, you know what its empty weight is, and the weights don't match up. Well, now you discard that hypothesis. It's a nail hypothesis no longer applies. So now you're going to measure and weigh the thing, and you're going to try to find something that maybe sounds the same that would weigh the right amount. Independently and sufficiently verified description of a direct link between cause and effect of a phenomenon, deduced from experiments and or observations. Scientific laws are considered established and universally applicable to certain class of things of phenomenon under appropriate conditions, but not necessarily definitive. These are called laws of science. What do we do with these laws and theories? We build models. We model the weather. We model everything you can possibly imagine, okay? And the more data you get, the more accurate the model. I remember when weather predictions were really pretty bad, okay? Now we have developed enough information about climate and meteorology that we have a pretty good feel. You have a pretty good feel for, is it going to rain today? What's the temperature going to be? And so these models, our weather models, are becoming more and more accurate every year. We're better able to predict if tornadoes are showing up. We're better able to predict if the conditions for hurricanes are going to arise, etc. Scientific theories help explain observations. If I hold up a ball and ask the question, what will happen if I let the ball go? Theory of gravity tells us it should fall. That's its prediction, is that it will fall. If we let the ball go and it falls, the theory predicted it would fall. That result helps validate the theory. If I do that 10,000 times, I've produced even more data. And that's how science works. We just keep amassing data. Physicists tend to go for laws versus the other science majors. What we can't prove about gravity, gravitons, no one's seen one. Why does gravitational force vary in some places? Here's a link to a good article that explains some of the problems with gravity. Okay, and here's a second one. Even though there's some things we can't answer about gravity or gravitational theory, does anybody not accept that gravity works? Well, okay, there are probably some people on the internet somewhere thinking gravity is false, but the majority of people are going to accept it. Here's some scientific theories out there. Cell theory, atomic theory, germ theory, plate tectonics, gravity, the list goes on. So why do some people reject scientific theories? Well, it's a difficult question. These are some of the reasons I've encountered. Well, they don't really know very much about the theories they reject. And in some cases, they will actively refuse to learn anything about a theory that they want to reject. Because if they read the data and listen to it with an open mind, it might provide them with some uncomfortable thoughts. Okay? Or a theory just makes them uncomfortable. They don't like thinking that that's how that works. Okay? If it conflicts with something they want to believe, you bet they're going to not accept it. They're going to fight it every inch of the way. And that's where we come back to that, the less you know about something, the more stubborn you will be about change. Here's the beautiful part. You don't have to accept a scientific theory. Okay? But even if you don't, be glad that scientists do. Why? Well, why do you think? We can use science to make everybody's lives better. Who's never taken an aspirin or a Tylenol or an ibuprofen? Have you ever been in a hospital and been sick? Well, chemistry has saved your life probably at some point in time. That cell phone that you love to use was generated through various scientific theories about radio waves, energy, and electronics. Okay? And again, most people won't have a problem accepting a scientific theory as fact if it doesn't conflict with something they want to believe. Here's one, the age of the Earth. It's determined through the use of chemistry, which involves valence theory, orbital theory, and atomic theory to measure the degradation of radioactive elements, radiometric data. Chemistry always works the same. If you put two chemicals together, they always react the same way. You might be able to speed the reaction up or slow it down, but ultimately, it's going to react the same way. And the results are in, guys. We've got a good feel for some of the oldest rocks that have been found on this planet. And it has been updated many times. History originally thought that the Earth was much younger, and then we found ways to measure chemically all of these different elements and how they degrade into other elements, and they do it at a constant rate. Okay, and through this process, we keep finding older and older rocks. The oldest rocks we've found now that have been confirmed are 5.5 billion, although in Greenland recently, some rocks have been found 5.6, 5.7 billion years old. Now, when I say recently, in science, recently can be 10, 20 years ago. Okay, because when you bring up this new data, it is thoroughly tested and checked. Medicine, again, every time you take a medicine, if chemistry didn't work, you would never know what that medicine would do. If chemistry doesn't work, your body wouldn't function, because basically you're a big sack of chemical reactions. Okay? You are a series of solutions separated by various membranes in which chemical reactions are occurring. Okay? And so to say that if you say, okay, I accept chemistry, I can take this medicine, that's safe. I can eat this food, that's safe. But I don't like what this chemistry about decay works. I don't like that, because that implies something that maybe conflicts with something I want to believe. And you can't have it both ways, guys. You either accept chemistry or you don't. Evolution. If evolution was false, then there would be no way to treat pathogens. We use chemistry to treat diseases, and we use evolution to understand things like antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Understanding evolution helps us to combat pathogens like viruses, bacteria, and parasites more effectively. Without the theory of evolution, many diseases would still be uncured and untreatable. Every theory is developed the same way. We use scientific method. There's no different ways for developing different theories. I've actually had people say, well, these theories were developed one way, but the ones I don't agree with weren't developed the same way, so that's why they're invalid. No, that's not true. That's just not true. They were all tested. Still not convinced? No problem. You're not alone. Throughout history, a lot of people have rejected scientific theories because it made them feel uncomfortable or conflicted with their beliefs. If everyone decided to accept all scientific theories around today, the next one would be contradicted by someone. It is inevitable. You will never get 100% of a group to agree on anything in this country or in this world. Because I'll have people tell me, oh, well, this theory, I know of this scientist that doesn't accept it. Okay. If he calls himself a scientist, now all I have to do to determine that is go look at what has he published. All right. If you're a scientist, you've done research. If you've done research, you've had to follow a certain methodology. If you're not following scientific method, you're not doing research. If you're embracing a non-testable hypothesis as science, you're not doing research. Okay? And so the last bit that really provides data that supports a theory is predictions. Okay? If we find something, we can make a prediction about it, and it fits with the theory and what the theory says should happen, that adds more data that that theory is correct. Let's take this guy. Charles Darwin, who proposed the hypothesis of evolution, saw these nectar tubes. These are orchids, and these are little tubes that fill up with nectar. Now, nectar is a high energy food source. Okay? It holds tremendous calories because it's sugar, it's carbs. And there is no energy source on this planet that is not being utilized by something. Energy doesn't go to waste. So he said there had to be, okay, orchids bloom at night. Okay? And he predicted that there was a moth or a bat or something with a very, very long tongue that would be able to utilize the energy from these nectar tubes. And he based it on his hypothesis. 30 years later, after he discovered and described this orchid, he found this moth. That is the moth's tongue. You can see it right there. Okay? So that supported his hypothesis. Second part of chapter 1, we're going to define life. Okay? Biology is the study of life, but in order to study something, we have to define it. This is pretty easy when you deal with large macro animals, but as we get to smaller organisms, it comes a little murky. Therefore, scientists, biologists have gotten together and identified 5 characteristics of life. To be considered alive, you must exhibit all of these characteristics. All right? Here's life, the property of quality that distinguishes living organisms from dead organisms. This is our terminology here, the definition. It's the qualities that distinguish between dead and inanimate matter manifested in functions such as metabolism, growth, reproduction, response to stimuli, or adaptation to the environment. Okay? Cells are the basic units of life. Anything below a cell is not considered to be alive. So we have little organelles in cells. These are not alive. Okay. So, I got a rock, I got a little boy. How do I know the boy's alive and the rock's not? Well, all life shares 5 characteristics. Okay. Here we go. Life is organized. The atom, smallest chemical unit of a type of pure substance, an element, is made up of an atom. Example, the carbon atom. When you put atoms together, you get molecules. Molecules are put together to form little organelles. These are little structures inside of a cell. Okay? The cell, fundamental unit of life. This little organelle is a chloroplast. It takes sunlight and converts it into glucose, basically. And here's our cell, and we can see different organelles in there. There's the nucleus, the nucleolus. These are chloroplasts. These are mitochondria. There's a Golgi apparatus. This is a vacuole, etc., etc. All right, it's a leaf cell. Now, when we put cells together, they make tissues. Right? Tissues put together make organs. When you put all the organs together, you form little organ systems. In trees, you have a vascular system. Okay? In humans, we have a nervous system. We have a digestive system, etc. When you put all of these organ systems together, we get an organism. There's the tree. Okay? It's an acacia thorn tree, by the way. Populations. Populations are groups of organisms of the same species, living in the same place and the same time. So if I look out across the big area of African savanna where this thorn acacia plant lives, there's going to be a lot of these trees. And when I put all these trees together, they're a population of thorn acacia trees. Now, a community. When I take populations of wildebeest and grass and weeds and trees and ants and mosquitoes and beetles and butterflies, etc., when I put all these things together, that's a community. All the populations that occupy that same region are considered a community of species. All right? And then when I take all of those living parts of the community and put them with all the abiotic or non-living parts, that makes our ecosystem. Okay? Now, these non-living parts cycle. Okay? Carbon constantly cycles. Trees, plants, animals are all made up of carbon. Carbon is one of the most important elements out there. But when an animal dies, the carbon is released. Okay, or when the animal takes in the carbon from one type of molecule and releases it as carbon dioxide. So carbon cycles through our environment constantly. All right. The biosphere. This is the part of our planet, this big rock, that supports life. You go too deep, nothing's alive. You go up too high, nothing's alive. It is just that little part of the planet, which is very, very thin, where life's possible. And it's a pretty old planet. It's pretty worn. If you look, it's pretty smooth. When we're looking at it from space, even though we have mountains like the Himalayas and the Rockies and things like that, in the grand scheme of things, they're not that tall. All right, when you look at the planet, it looks pretty darn round. Emergent properties. This is a really important concept to understand. If an endothelial cell can do a few things, when I put a bunch of endothelial cells together and form a capillary, it can do not only the things endothelial cells can do, it can now do other things. And emergent properties are very important in life. It's basically, as we organize and form larger structures, we get more functions out of things. So organization, that is our number one characteristic of life. All life is organized. The second one is energy use. To be alive, you have to be using energy. Now, on our planet, the majority of our energy comes from the sun. The sun sends down energy, and this energy is absorbed by plants. They're called producers. And they take carbon dioxide from the air and the soil and convert it into a sugar, glucose. Or in some cases, they might convert it into several other carbohydrate chains. Some we can eat, some we can't. But when you take this sun and it gives its energy, 100% of the energy hits the plant, but it can only use about 10%. The other 90% is reflected off as heat. Okay. These producers are called autotrophs. They make their own food. We'll talk about this in a chapter a little later, where the chloroplasts, how they function. They take energy and produce a sugar. And then they use that sugar to build biomass. Okay, so they make their own food. Now, here's a consumer. It eats the plant. Anything that survives by eating something else is called a heterotroph. It doesn't make its own food. It depends upon the producers to make the food. Now, again, there's a loss. So of the 100% of the energy this leaf provides, when this little guy here eats it, he's only going to use about 10% of the energy, and the rest will be radiated off of his body as heat. When he dies, he will be decomposed. Decomposers eat the dead animals and obtain nutrients, and they recycle them. Organisms and organic wastes are produced. Okay, they can eat any of that stuff. And so this is an important part. So all of the molecules that became organized die, and then they become disorganized again. They're broken back down into their elements. But when we inject more energy into the system, we again form an organization. This deals with entropy or not. Okay? Yes, this plant will be eaten, it will eventually die, and those things will be decomposed and recycled. Now, if there was no sun, once all of these things had been used, okay, entropy would have occurred. This guy would have broken down, but by generating energy from a sun and injecting it into the system, you are reversing entropy. You are taking disorder, all the elements of these dead organisms, and reassembling them in an organized manner into where they're now a new plant or a new animal, or etc. Okay? Heat's lost at every level, and so each one of these levels is called a trophic level, T-R-O-P-H-I-C, and these levels transfer about 10% of the energy. Maintenance of internal constancy. That's also called homeostasis. To be alive, every organism that is alive can exist within a certain set of limits of temperature, humidity, oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc., etc. To be alive, your body is constantly adjusting your body temperature. If it gets too hot, it sheds heat. If it gets too cold, it'll generate heat. If you get hungry, you'll eat some food. If you've got plenty of food, it'll make a fat cell. If you get hungry again and you don't have anything to eat, it'll digest the energy in the fat cells. So you're constantly making little adjustments in your body. Okay? If you can do that, you're alive. If you cannot do that, you are not alive. Here's kind of how it works, homeostasis. The heater, okay? If the room gets too warm, okay, there's basically there's a little strip in there that will bend and it opens the switch. The heater turns off, okay? Now, once the heater turns off and hot air is not blowing out, the room slowly cools down. When the room gets cold enough, right, gets too cold, this little strip will straighten out, it closes the connection, and it forms an electrical connection, it kicks the heater on. And it will pump warm air out again until we get to a warm enough temperature that the thermostat is looking for, and then it cools down. So it's constantly going from a point where it gets too hot to a point where it gets too cold. And this is called a negative feedback loop. And so what happens, if it's too cold, it acts to make it warmer. If it's too hot, it acts to make it cooler. Negative feedback loops move opposite of the initial stimuli. The initial stimuli, it's too cold, so now it's going to cause the system to get warmer. That's the opposite of cold. When it gets too hot, it's going to move the system to colder, which is the opposite of heat. Negative feedback systems. Okay. Humans have internal thermostats that help maintain temperature homeostasis. It's not just for temperature, though. There's all kinds of things that fluctuate in your body, even levels of certain chemicals or molecules. Next, reproduction, growth, and development. It's to be alive, you've got to be able to reproduce, to grow, and develop. Okay, there's a couple ways we see this in nature, asexual or sexual. And there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those. Offspring of asexually reproducing organisms are identical generally to the single parent. Occasionally, you will see some mutations occur, but they don't occur as fast in asexually reproducing species. What it tends to happen is they just keep cloning out copies of themselves. Okay, that's a good way to get a high population really fast. Okay, fungi will reproduce asexually, and then each of these little spores will become a new organism. Asexual reproduction is very successful in environments that are unchanging. You don't want an environment that fluctuates very much. You won't find a lot of asexual reproducers in areas where the habitat fluctuates in, say, temperature or moisture or whatever. So, there's these asexual reproducers are in areas that are very, very stable. Now, sexually reproducing receive genetic material from two parents, and so you're constantly getting new mixtures of the genetic material, the DNA. By getting it from two sources, you get new mixtures of DNA that maybe have never been around before, that might produce something that gives that new animal a better chance to survive. Okay? It is most successful in very changing environments. Okay? The offspring are unlike each parent, but they have genetic variability. So if there's this population of deer, and let's say this population of deer have a certain size and fat content, okay? And the larger they are, the more calories they need. Now, let's say there are some deer that were born when these sexually reproducing adults produced offspring that tended to be a little smaller. And then you go into a drought and there's not as much food. A smaller animal has an advantage because it doesn't need to eat as many calories to stay alive. And so while the larger animals in the environment will die, the younger animals in the environment will not. Last one, evolution. You have to evolve. We live in an ever-changing world. Our climate goes through swings. We have freezings or coolings. We have heating up. We have all different kinds of things that occur. Now, some of them are naturally occurring. Some of them can be exacerbated by, another part of the environment, the animals. Okay? Animals give off waste products that can affect things. Technology is something generated and invented by an animal species, us. And we do produce massive amounts of carbon dioxide. Now, nature produces a lot of carbon dioxide, okay? But when you add what nature's producing to what man is producing, and if you look at the real numbers, you'll see huge numbers of tons of carbon dioxide going into our environment every day. And that's coming from technology. And that can have effects. Okay. Some of the fantastic critters that have shown up due to evolution. Here is a desert snake that buries his head, a little viper. He's an ambush predator, and that's all you can really see of him until his prey comes along, and then he jumps up and grabs it. Here is a gaboon viper. Now, here's one that I used to have in captivity, and you can see he's got this striking pattern. That's camouflage, but you're going, well, how can that be camouflage? Well, it's pretty easy. I actually put him in a naturalistic habitat like he would have in his natural range, and you can see it could be pretty easy to step on this guy and not even see him. Same thing with copperheads, right? Here's one on a rock that I caught, and this is one, and then I put him over in an area with leaves and things, and he just kind of disappears. This is how antibiotic-resistant bacteria have evolved. What happens? Well, you get a bacterial infection. The doctor gives you some antibiotics. You take the antibiotics, and it kills most of the bacteria. Now, most people don't take all their antibiotics. If you get a 30-day antibiotic, you should take it for 30 days. If you don't, you are helping to produce antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Oh, but I feel better. I don't need this last 4 days. Well, that just means the amount of disease-causing bacteria has dropped to a point that it's not causing any effects in you. But that leftover bacteria is more resistant to the antibiotic. That's why it's still there. So by taking all of your antibiotics, you have a better chance of killing all the bacteria that you have in your system, even the really resistant ones. Okay, because you just keep hitting them with those antibiotics. And luckily, because of that, we have wonderful things. We have some things like this that are antibiotic resistant. There's an anthrax disease, Bacillus anthracis. There's gonorrhea. There's now an STD. It used to be you'd get gonorrhea, you'd go get a shot of antibiotics, it clears it right up. Now there are some strains of gonorrhea that you can't cure. You know, you get it forever, sort of like luggage. MRSA, it's a staph infection. These developed in hospitals. Why? Well, hospitals are really good at trying to be as sterile as they can, but they're never 100% sterile, and they never get 100% of the bacteria. So of this Staphylococcus bacterium, only the toughest survived. And if you've ever known anybody that had a staph infection like this, or MRSA, you would understand just how devastating it can be. Typhus can be treated with antibiotics, but it's increasingly becoming resistant. Now, we can try to develop new antibiotics, and sometimes those will work. And so that's what we try to do. Let's talk about prions and viruses. Prions reproduce and evolve and force other cells to reproduce them. But prions can't reproduce themselves, and they're not really alive. They're just misshapen proteins, and they produce things like mad cow disease. Viruses can't reproduce on their own. They have to get a host, because viruses are just little strips of DNA or RNA covered by a protein coat. It gets inside of a cell and hijacks the machinery of the nucleus to make copies of itself. Okay? Now, some people will confuse this, because it is parasitic, with, like, say, a parasitic worm. But a parasitic worm doesn't require on the machinery of the host to reproduce it. It just, that's its habitat. Okay? And there is a difference. Scientific classification. You've probably seen those big, long words in Latin. And that science is called taxonomy. That is our attempt to try to name and organize every living organism on the planet. Plant, animal, bacteria, etc. Now, we have domains. When I was in college, we didn't have domains. The farthest we went up were kingdoms. But they have since developed domains, which are larger groups. Now, a species is the lowest level, whereas the highest level would be the domain. So you have the domain here, eukarya. This is every organism that has a nucleus. Prokaryotes. These are all the organisms that are alive that do not have a nucleus. And there's two domains of prokaryotes. There are the bacteria and the archaea. The archaea are the really old bacteria. These are very, very primitive, meaning archaic, okay, that have been around a very long time. Okay. Each domain has one or more kingdoms, and that's what all of these little lines are, kingdoms, right? Fungi, animals, and plants. A lot of different kingdoms of bacteria and archaea. The number of kingdoms of protists are constantly in flux, and the scientists that study those are some of the most argumentative scientists in the world, in my opinion, because none of them can ever seem to agree on anything. When we look at this thing, we call it the tree of life. The three main branches are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Here's some electron micrographs of an archaic bacteria and of a modern bacteria. And then we have all the eukaryas, the ones with a nucleus. Starting with the lowest ones would be single-celled protists, okay, to the highest ones, which would be some of the animals. Now, autotrophs or heterotrophs. Autotroph, remember, means they make their own food. There are some organisms in here, like plants, that make their own food. Heterotrophs are organisms that eat other things. And in these protistans, there are some things we call the protistan algae that will eat other protists, but they also have chloroplasts that allow them to make some of their own food. Here are the animals, everything from bees to us. The fungi, these are fascinating organisms. They eat, they poop, but they can't move, so they're sessile. They have kind of some characteristics of both plant and animal. They have an alternation of generations that is very similar to plants. There's a little bit there if you want to read about them. Right? Kingdom plants, planty. Now here is a vocabulary list. I've assembled these to the best of my ability. Sometimes I've repeated some. If I do, forgive me. But these are some words you probably need to know to do well on our tests. And that will finish up Chapter 1.